The courtroom erupted in laughter when Judge Lenora Vance looked at the mud-stained clothes of Darius Whitlock and asked how a black farmer like him could possibly own land worth $14 million. She threw out his documents, called his testimony a desperate fantasy, and prepared to hand his family's farm to a real estate empire. But just as her gavel rose for the final blow, the courtroom doors burst open. 6 federal agents walked in, carrying files that proved the deed to his land had been forged by someone nobody in that room ever expected. The story begins on a September morning, weeks before that scene in the courtroom, when Darius Whitlock stood in the middle of a soybean field on Whitlock Ridge, the farm that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. His father used to tell him that land was never just measured in dollars. It held memory, sweat, and the dignity of everyone who had worked it before him. Darius was 43 years old, a quiet man who wore work clothes stained with years of labor and drove a pickup truck that had rolled well past 10 years of service. Few people in Bellwether, Georgia, knew that Darius had once worked as a land records analyst for a federal land management agency in Washington, before his father's death called him home to run the farm himself. That morning, as fog lifted off the fields, he had no idea that 4 generations of history were about to be challenged by a stack of paper someone else had created. Darius had returned to Bellwether 11 years earlier, after his father suffered a stroke while repairing a fence line and never fully recovered. He had walked away from a comfortable government salary in Washington without hesitation, packing a single suitcase and driving south through the night, because the farm in his mind was never something that could simply wait for a convenient season. Over the following decade, he rebuilt the irrigation system with his own hands, replanted acres that had gone fallow, and slowly earned back the trust of neighbors who remembered a much younger man who had once seemed destined to leave Georgia for good. By the time this story truly begins, Darius Whitlock was simply known around town as a steady, private man who paid his debts on time and kept mostly to himself, never once mentioning the years he had spent studying land ownership systems from the inside. A line of black sport utility vehicles rolled up the gravel drive without warning. Representatives from Carrington Development arrived alongside the county sheriff carrying an order demanding that Darius vacate the eastern section of his own farm. They claimed that Carrington Development had legally purchased 1,240 acres from a distant relative of the Whitlock family, a transaction Darius had never heard of in his life. He read through the papers they handed him and noticed something wrong. Almost immediately, the map coordinates on the deed used a classification system that had not existed until years after the supposed date of sale. It meant the document could not possibly have been created. When it claimed to have been created, a detail most people would have missed entirely, but a detail Darius recognized within seconds because of the very career he had left behind years earlier. Darius calmly refused to leave. He explained that the land had never been sold and that the relative named in the transaction had died years before the date on the signature. Blaine Carrington himself stepped out of one of the vehicles, smiling as if this were a friendly visit, and offered Darius $600,000 to walk away quietly and spare himself the trouble of a fight he could not possibly win. When Darius refused, Blaine's tone shifted, and he warned that if the matter went to court, Darius would lose not just the disputed acres, but the entire farm once the legal bills came due. Darius told him that land could be taken by power, but the truth did not change simply because a wealthy man wanted it to disappear. Within days, a formal summons arrived at the farmhouse. Carrington Development was suing him for the unlawful occupation of property, valued at $14 million, and the case would be heard before the most influential judge in the county. Blaine Carrington had spent nearly 20 years building a reputation as the most generous businessman in the region and funding a new wing at the county hospital, sponsoring the high school football team and appearing in local newspapers, beside smiling school children at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Behind that carefully polished image, though Blaine had grown accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, and he had learned long ago that a warm smile could accomplish what threats alone never could, at least in public. He genuinely believed in his own mind that men like Darius were simply obstacles standing between Bellwether and prosperity, and that anyone who refused a generous offer had only themselves to blame for whatever followed. It was this belief more than greed alone that allowed him to sleep soundly at night while quietly authorizing the destruction of another family's history on paper. Word of the lawsuit spread through Bellwether within a matter of hours. Longtime neighbors who had known the Whitlock family for decades suddenly found themselves uncertain what to believe, caught between old loyalty and the polished paperwork that Carrington Development was quick to circulate around town. Some remembered Darius's grandfather clearing that same land by hand, while others whispered that no ordinary farmer could really hold on to something worth $14 million without cutting a corner somewhere along the way. Darius refused to explain himself to anyone outside of a courtroom, a decision that struck many as stubborn pride, though in truth, it was something closer to patience. He had learned during his years working with federal land data that quiet documentation eventually outlasted loud accusations, even if it took time for the truth to surface. Darius sought out Tobias Mercer, a civil rights attorney who had spent years helping farmers fight back against land seizures across the state. After reviewing the paperwork, Tobias admitted that Carrington's side had assembled a chain of documents that looked almost flawless. A transfer deed, tax receipts, notarized signatures, and updated entries inside the county's official database. Darius insisted every one of those documents had been manufactured after the fact, and he proved it by pulling out the farm's original survey maps from the 1970s and private water rights records his family had kept locked in a safe for decades. He also revealed for the first time that he had once worked directly with federal land mapping data and that he understood how every boundary change left a digital trace behind whether anyone wanted it found or not. Tobias asked why Darius had never mentioned his background before. Darius answered that he did not want to win because of a former title. He wanted to prove that an ordinary farmer deserved to be heard by the law just as much as anyone else, without needing a resume to earn that basic respect. At the first hearing, Judge Lenora Vance denied a request for an independent audit of the county's land record system, declaring that Carrington's deed carried, in her words, sufficient appearance of validity on its face. It was an unusual reversal of the normal order of things. The man who had owned the land for decades was now being forced to prove his own ownership against a company that had shown up only months earlier with a folder full of paperwork. Maribel Sloan had built her entire career on cases exactly like this one, where a wealthy client faced an opponent without the resources to fight back on equal footing. She was 46 years old, meticulous in every detail of her presentation, and privately confident that the outcome of this case had been decided long before either side ever set foot in the courtroom. She viewed Darius not as a villain, but simply as an inconvenience, a man standing in the way of a transaction that, in her mind, had already been settled through channels far more important than a farmer's testimony. It was this cold certainty, more than any single piece of evidence, that made her so dangerous during those early weeks of the trial. Maribel Sloan, the lead attorney for Carrington Development, went further and requested that the court freeze the farm's operating accounts, leaving Darius unable to buy fertilizer or make payments on his seasonal loan. Outside the courthouse, the local newspaper ran his photograph beside a headline, suggesting he was clinging to millions of dollars of property that never belonged to him in the first place. The town began to split into two camps, some standing quietly behind the Whitlock name, and others repeating the story that Darius was simply a man who refused to accept reality. With his accounts frozen, Darius spent those weeks bartering labor for diesel fuel and selling off equipment he had spent years restoring simply to keep the farm's animals fed and its remaining crops from dying in the field. He never once complained about it publicly, though Tobias noticed the toll it was taking the way. Darius had grown thinner, quieter, and slower to smile than he had been just months before. Neighbors who still believed in him began quietly leaving bags of feed and cash envelopes on his porch at night, unwilling to be seen helping a man the newspaper had already convicted in print. Late one night, an envelope arrived at his door with no return address. Inside was a copy of a system access log showing that his farm's ownership records had been altered at 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, long after any county office should have been open for business. The night before the trial opened, Blaine met privately with Maribel in his office overlooking the future site of the resort, going over every detail of their strategy one final time. Blaine reminded her that Judge Lenora had approved 3 of his previous development projects without ever asking an uncomfortable question, and that her continued cooperation depended entirely on keeping their arrangement exactly as informal as it had always been. Maribel assured him that Darius had no resources, no connections, and no realistic path to challenging a judge who had already shown where her sympathies rested. Neither of them imagined, sitting in that office with a bottle of expensive wine between them, that the very confidence fueling their plan would eventually become the evidence used to dismantle it entirely. The trial opened in a courtroom packed with spectators, eager to see how a farmer with mud on his boots would fare against one of the most powerful development firms in the region. Blaine Carrington sat in the front row in an expensive suit, greeted warmly by bank executives and local business leaders who saw him as a man bringing investment to a struggling town. Darius walked in, wearing work boots, still caked with mud, because he had spent the morning repairing an irrigation line before rushing to make it on time. Judge Lenora looked him over from the bench and asked in front of everyone whether he understood this was a courtroom and not a machine shed. A ripple of laughter passed through the gallery, and Darius said nothing, choosing to let the moment pass rather than give her the reaction she seemed to be hoping for. When Tobias began laying out the Whitlock family's decades of documented ownership, Lenora repeatedly cut him off, demanding he skip ahead to what she called modern evidence rather than old history. Maribel presented a deed bearing the signature of Darius's late uncle, complete with a notary's seal that looked entirely official to anyone in the room who was not trained to notice small inconsistencies buried inside the seal. Formatting. When Darius was called to testify, Lenora asked him, with open sarcasm, what qualified a farmer to believe he understood land records better than trained professionals hired by a major company. He answered, in plain, unhurried terms, explaining map codes, coordinate systems, and digital timestamps, only for her to interrupt again, and announced that the courtroom did not need what she called a lecture from a man who had never attended law school in his life. At one point, Lenora asked Darius to describe in detail how a man who spent his mornings covered in fertilizer and machine grease could possibly claim to understand a legal document at all. Darius answered that dirt on a man's hands had never once made the numbers on a survey map any less true, and that he had read enough forged records over the years to recognize one within the first few minutes of looking. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats at the steadiness in his voice, though Lenora simply moved on as though the answer had not landed at all. She then asked how much money he kept in the bank, as if the size of his account determined whether he had the right to own the ground beneath his own house. Darius replied that ownership did not depend on a man's clothing, his balance sheet, or the color of his skin standing in front of the bench. The room fell silent for a moment before Lenora warned him for what she called disrespecting the court with his tone. Tobias objected to the personal attacks on his client's character, but the objection was overruled without any real discussion. Maribel asked the court to formally recognize the entire disputed property as belonging to Carrington Development, and it seemed for the first time that Darius had nowhere left to turn. Before adjourning for the day, Lenora announced she would issue a preliminary ruling the following morning, adding that the outcome was in her own words, already fairly clear to anyone paying attention. That night, Tobias wanted to file a motion for the judge's removal, furious at how openly biased the proceedings had become. But Darius asked him to wait until they had something concrete to stand on. Darius pulled out the access log from the unmarked envelope and traced the login credentials back to an administrator who had officially retired 3 years earlier, a man named Everett Grady. He and Tobias drove out to Everett's house on the edge of town that same night. And when Everett heard the name Whitlock through the door, his hands began to shake before he even let them inside. Once he finally found the courage to speak, Everett admitted he had discovered a cluster of land records altered outside of normal business hours years earlier, every single one tied to parcels that Carrington Development was actively trying to acquire. Everett explained that he had reported the irregularities to his supervisors at the time and had been pressured into signing early retirement papers within a month of raising the alarm. His old login credentials, he said, were still being used long after he left the office, proof that someone had stolen his access rather than simply reusing an abandoned account by accident. Before he was pushed out, he had quietly copied a portion of the suspicious data onto a personal hard drive for safekeeping, but that drive vanished after his home was broken into. Not long afterward, an event the local police had written off as a random burglary. He revealed one more crucial detail. Before they left, only 3 people in the entire county held the authority to reactivate a retired administrator's account. Everett confessed that he had spent nearly 3 years jumping at unfamiliar cars parked near his mailbox and refusing to answer his phone unless he recognized the number on the screen. He had told himself over and over that his silence was the price of safety, and that no single retired clerk could ever hope to stand against a company with Carrington's resources and connections throughout the county. Hearing Darius describe the very same forged classification codes he had once discovered himself was the first thing in 3 years that made Everett feel less like a frightened old man and more like someone who might finally be believed. One was the director of the Land Records Office. Another was the county's information systems administrator. The third was the administrative judge responsible for approving special transfers at that particular time, a judge named Lenora Vance. Tobias believed this might finally be the proof of a conflict of interest they had been searching for, but Darius remained more cautious, suspecting that whoever was truly behind the scheme wanted suspicion aimed squarely at the judge rather than at themselves. As they left Everett's property, an unmarked car followed them for several miles before turning off into the dark without explanation. When Darius arrived home that night, the power to the entire farm had been cut, and the door to his family's old safe had been pried open, its contents of original survey documents and historical records completely gone. Standing in the dark kitchen with a flashlight in his hand, Darius understood that someone was no longer content to simply steal his land on paper. They were now willing to erase the physical proof of his family's history altogether, piece by piece, until nothing remained to argue with. The following morning, police arrived at the farm with a warrant of their own. Inside Darius's storage shed, they discovered several documents reported stolen from the county land records office planted there sometime during the night, while the property sat dark and unguarded. Darius realized immediately that he had been set up, and within hours he was led into the courthouse in handcuffs while photographers captured the moment for the morning papers. The very image his enemies had wanted the town to see all along. Standing before the crowded gallery, Judge Lenora accused him of tampering with evidence and threatened to pursue charges for forging public records, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had already decided his guilt long before, hearing a single word in his defense. Maribel argued that the discovery of these documents on his property proved Darius had known all along that his own paperwork was fraudulent and that his calm demeanor throughout the trial had simply been a performance. Tobias demanded fingerprint analysis, access logs, and security footage from the storage shed, but Lenora refused to delay the proceedings, even a single day, declaring that Darius had turned a simple property dispute into a criminal matter through his own reckless actions. In perhaps her most humiliating moment yet, she asked him to look around the courtroom and admit out loud in front of everyone that he had finally lost. Darius did not raise his voice. He looked directly at her and said that a forged piece of paper could fool a room for a while, but it could never rewrite the actual history of a piece of land that his family had worked for 100 years. Lenora mocked him for still talking about history when, as she put it, modern evidence was standing squarely against him, in black and white. That same night, Tobias quietly sent the access logs, Everett's statement, and details of the break-in to the Federal Bureau's field office in Atlanta, hoping someone with real authority might finally take notice. At almost the same moment, Special Agent Rochelle Maddox, 44 years old, and already deep into an investigation of suspicious financial activity tied to Carrington Development, was reviewing a chain of bank transfers that kept leading back to a consulting firm with no actual employees, something called Bellwether Civic Solutions. She discovered that this shell company had quietly paid a court official and a county technology specialist over the previous 2 years and when Tobias's package landed on her desk soon afterward, she recognized instantly that Whitlock Ridge was the missing piece, connecting every thread of her investigation into one coherent picture. While out on bail, Darius returned to studying the old survey maps stacked across his kitchen table late into the night. He noticed that the forged deed not only used the wrong classification code, but described a creek that had actually changed course back in 1989, a detail no honest surveyor working from real field data could possibly have gotten wrong. Darius led Tobias deep into the woods on the eastern edge of the property to a stone marker placed decades earlier by the United States Geological Survey. Its surface worn smooth by weather, but its engraved numbers still perfectly legible. The coordinates stamped into that marker did not match the map Carrington had submitted to the court, and because that federal data was stored outside of any system the county could reach, it was effectively impossible for anyone at the local level to quietly change it. Tobias asked how Darius had known exactly where to find that marker in the first place, buried so deep in the tree line. Darius finally laid out the rest of his history. Years spent working on a federal project to digitize land boundaries across several states, during which he had personally identified weaknesses in how small counties managed their ownership records. He had once warned in an internal federal report few people ever read that rural counties were vulnerable to exactly this kind of manipulation if no outside system ever cross-checked their data against the original source. Tobias finally understood why Darius had remained so calm through every insult and setback he had endured. He had always believed the federal data would eventually speak for itself no matter how long it took to be heard. Rochelle had spent the better part of a career chasing cases exactly like this one. Cases where powerful men assumed that paperwork alone could erase inconvenient truths if it was formatted correctly and stamped by the right official. She had learned to distrust confidence long before she trusted evidence, and something about the speed and polish of the Whitlock Ridge transaction had bothered her from the very first bank record she pulled months earlier. Rather than approach the county directly, where she suspected at least one insider was compromised, she built her case quietly from the outside, cross-referencing Federal Survey archives, banking disclosures, and personnel records, until a pattern finally emerged that no defense attorney could easily explain away. Only once she felt certain the pattern would hold under cross-examination did she finally reach out to the one man whose testimony could tie every thread together. Rochelle arranged a quiet meeting with Darius, inside an empty warehouse outside of town, telling him that federal agents had been watching Carrington development for 8 months, without a clean way to connect Blaine directly to the forged records. She needed Darius to formally confirm the differences between the county's version of the land data and the original federal survey information in order to secure a search warrant that would hold up in court. Darius agreed to cooperate on one condition: that Rochelle guarantee protection for Everett, who was clearly in danger for what he already knew and had already suffered for once before. Before their meeting ended, Rochelle revealed one more detail that changed everything. Someone inside the courthouse had approved special access to the county's record system on the exact night the Whitlock Ridge files were altered, and the electronic signature on that approval belonged to Judge Lenora Vance. That herself. Darius absorbed the information without visible surprise, though he told Rochelle he still believed there was more to the story than a judge simply forging her own crime in plain sight for anyone to find. The final hearing took place before federal agents had finished executing their warrants. Tobias asked for a short delay, citing new evidence connected to an active federal investigation, but Lenora refused, declaring that her courtroom would not be held hostage by what she called desperate last-minute theories. Maribel delivered her closing argument, painting Blaine as a visionary, bringing jobs to a struggling town, and Darius as a man clinging to property he could never properly manage or deserve on his own. Blaine even used the moment to announce a planned resort development worth $300 million, complete with promises of hundreds of new local jobs, and several people in the gallery began to nod along as though taking Darius's land was simply the price of progress finally arriving in Dada. Bellwether. Tobias pushed back hard, arguing that prosperity built on forged paperwork was nothing more than theft, dressed up in expensive clothing, and a friendly smile. When Darius was finally given the chance to speak, he told the room about relatives who had held on to this land through economic collapse, drought, and decades of open discrimination. Land that had been dismissed as worthless when his family owned it and was suddenly valued at $14 million the moment a corporation wanted it instead. Lenora grew visibly impatient, accusing him of turning a property case into a speech about social injustice, rather than sticking to the facts of the matter. She began reading aloud a ruling that would transfer full ownership of Whitlock Ridge to Carrington Development, and Darius noticed that the document in her hands ran dozens of pages, clearly written and printed, long before closing arguments had even finished that morning. Tobias rose to object, and Lenora threatened to hold him in contempt on the spot if he interrupted her again. As she lifted her gavel to formally announce the transfer of everything his family had ever owned, the courtroom doors swung open with a force that startled the entire gallery. Special Agent Rochelle Maddox walked in with 6 federal agents behind her, and she immediately ordered a halt to any ruling involving Whitlock Ridge before another word could be spoken. Lenora, furious, insisted that federal agents had no authority to interrupt proceedings in her courtroom until Rochelle produced a signed search warrant and arrest warrant, authorized by a federal judge, documents that made clear this was no longer simply a local property dispute between neighbors. For a moment, nobody in the gallery moved at all, as though the sight of federal agents filling the aisle of a small county courtroom belonged to some other town entirely. Blaine rose halfway from his seat before one of the agents motioned for him to sit back down, and the confident smile he had worn through every prior hearing finally began to falter for the first time in front of an audience. Somewhere near the back of the room, one of the very reporters who had photographed Darius in handcuffs weeks earlier was already typing furiously into a notebook, sensing that the story he had been covering was about to become something else entirely. The agents moved directly toward Blaine Carrington, Maribel Sloan, and the county's technology director and the courtroom dissolved into noise and confusion within seconds. Rochelle announced that Carrington Development was under federal investigation for land transfer fraud, money laundering, bribery of public officials, and unauthorized access to a government record system. She presented digital evidence proving that the deed to Darius's land had actually been created 3 years after the date printed on the document, with a notary's signature copied directly from an unrelated file and a digital fingerprint that traced back to a computer inside Maribel Sloan's own law office. The investigation showed that Everett's old account had been reactivated by the county's technology administrator, a man who had received more than $180,000 from a shell company controlled by Blaine over Dever.com. The course of 2 years. Evidence also confirmed that Blaine had personally arranged for the stolen documents to be planted inside Darius's storage shed, transforming an innocent man into a suspect almost overnight, and nearly derailing the entire case in the Sixton Elapisech process. The largest remaining question in the room was the exact role Judge Lenora had played in all of it, and every eye turned toward the bench waiting for an answer. Rochelle confirmed that Lenora's electronic signature had indeed been used to approve special access to the record system, though the truth turned out to be more complicated than outright forgery on her part. Lenora insisted her signature had been stolen, and that she had no knowledge of any conspiracy, and in one narrow sense, she was telling the truth. Rochelle explained that Blaine and Maribel had simply taken advantage of Lenora's habit of approving batches of administrative orders without carefully reviewing each one, a courtesy that Carrington Development had rewarded for years, through quiet donations to her re-election campaigns and a charitable foundation that carried her own name. Lenora had never personally drafted a forged deed, Rochelle explained, but she had accepted the benefits, ignored earlier warning signs, and allowed her sympathies toward wealthy developers to shape how she treated the case from its very first. Hearing onward, Rochelle then revealed that the person who had physically copied Lenora's signature was the court's own chief clerk, someone who had fled town overnight and had just been apprehended trying to board a flight out of the state under a different name. Blaine turned on Maribel in front of everyone, accusing her of betrayal, while Maribel insisted she had only ever followed his direct instructions from the very beginning of the scheme. Rochelle signaled her agents, and both Blaine and Maribel were placed in handcuffs and led out of the courtroom in full view of the very crowd that had laughed at Darius only weeks earlier. For the first time since the case began, Lenora looked at Darius without a trace of contempt in her expression, seeming to understand perhaps for the first time in years how her own arrogance had made her a useful tool inside someone else's carefully constructed scheme. News of the arrests spread through Bellwether even faster than the original lawsuit ever had, and the same newspaper that once printed Darius's photograph beside an accusing headline now ran a front-page story detailing the full scope of the fraud. Neighbors who had doubted him during the trial began stopping by the farm with quiet apologies, some bringing food, others simply admitting they should have asked more questions before believing what they read. Darius accepted their apologies without bitterness, though he made a point of telling more than one visitor that the same doubt they had shown him was exactly the kind of doubt that had allowed men like Blaine to operate freely for so many years in the first place. The town, for the first time in a generation, began asking harder questions about who really controlled its land records and why so few people had ever thought to check. The case was quickly transferred to federal court, where original data from the United States Geological Survey confirmed that all 1,900 acres belonged unquestionably to the Whitlock family, exactly as Darius had insisted from the United States Geological Survey. Very first day. Independent experts identified 6 separate technical errors buried inside the forged deed flaws that an ordinary person would almost certainly never have noticed without specialized training. Darius himself became one of the most important expert witnesses in the case, walking the jury through exactly how the county's record system had been manipulated, how timestamps had been quietly altered, and why the map code on Carrington's deed simply could not have existed on the date it claimed to have been created. During 3 full days of testimony, Darius calmly walked the jury through each of the 6 technical errors, one at a time, translating dense coordinate data into language any juror could follow, without a background in surveying or law. He explained how a single incorrect classification digit, invisible to an untrained eye, was enough to prove that an entire chain of paperwork had been assembled years after the fact, rather than decades earlier, as claimed. Defense attorneys for Blaine attempted to challenge his credibility on cross-examination, suggesting his former federal position gave him a personal motive to invent inconsistencies where none truly existed. Darius simply invited them to have any independent surveyor check the same coordinates against the federal archive, an offer none of them ever chose to take him up on in front of the jury. Other families across the county soon came forward, describing how they too had been pressured into selling land after their own ownership records mysteriously changed overnight without explanation. As the investigation widened, it became clear that Blaine had seized more than 8,000 acres over the years through the exact same pattern of manipulation, with the total value of targeted properties climbing past $70 million across the region. Maribel agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, turning over emails, recorded conversations, and secret payment records that filled in the final gaps of the case against her former employer. Blaine was charged with multiple federal offenses, and both the former chief clerk and the county's technology administrator were formally arrested and charged as well in the weeks that followed. Judge Lenora was suspended from the bench, placed under a formal ethics investigation, and ultimately forced to resign from her position entirely once the full scope of her negligence became public record. During a public hearing months later, she admitted in front of cameras and colleagues that she had judged Darius by his clothing, his occupation, and the color of his skin long before she had ever seriously considered the actual evidence sitting in front of her. She admitted that she had allowed years of comfortable donations and quiet favors to slowly reshape how she viewed the people who appeared before her until she could no longer tell the difference between genuine legal reasoning and simple deference to wealth. Colleagues who had known her for decades sat in stunned silence as she described how easily her judgment had been purchased, not through a single bribe, but through years of small, unremarkable kindnesses that asked for nothing in return until the day they finally did. She apologized for allowing the authority of her courtroom to become a tool of humiliation against a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong from the very beginning. Darius did not respond with satisfaction or bitterness in his voice. He simply told her that an apology only carried real meaning if the system itself changed enough to keep the same thing from happening to somebody else down the road. The federal court formally voided every forged document connected to Whitlock Ridge and fully restored ownership to Darius and his family, closing a struggle that had nearly cost him everything he had ever known. He also received compensation for his financial losses, his legal expenses, and the damage caused by the freezing of his farm accounts during the long months of the trial. Special Agent Rochelle later told him that if he had not understood land records as deeply as he did, the entire scheme might have quietly succeeded without a single person ever noticing the fraud buried beneath the surface. Darius replied that countless other people had lost their land for the simple reason that nobody had ever bothered to truly listen to them in the first place, and that was the real injustice worth fixing. A year later, Whitlock Ridge remained exactly what it had always been, a working farm rather than a golf resort or a row of luxury vacation homes overlooking a private lake. Darius used part of his settlement to establish the Whitlock Land Defense Center, an organization offering free help to farmers and small landowners who wanted their ownership records checked for tampering before it was too late to fight back. Tobias became the center's legal director, while Everett joined as an administrative consultant, finally free from the fear that had shaped every quiet year of his early retirement. Within its first year, the Whitlock Land Defense Center helped an elderly widow, 2 counties over, prove that a similar scheme had quietly stripped her family of 40 acres, nearly a decade earlier land she had long assumed was simply lost. For good, Darius sat with her personally, walking through her old survey records the same way Tobias had once walked through his, and when the county finally reversed the fraudulent transfer, she wept in the very office Darius had built with money he never wanted in the first place. Stories like hers began arriving weekly, each one a reminder that Whitlock Ridge had never been an isolated case so much as the first thread anyone had bothered to pull. Rochelle continued tracking the wider network connected to Blaine's operation, uncovering similar patterns of land fraud stretching into neighboring states where other quiet families had lost everything without ever understanding why. The county council passed new regulations requiring that any high-value change in land ownership be cross-checked against federal records and reviewed by an independent auditor before it could ever be finalized again. Lenora's old courtroom now belonged to a new judge, one who insisted that every person appearing before the bench be treated with the same basic fairness, regardless of their job, their clothing, or their standing in the community around them. In the closing scene, Darius stood on a low hill overlooking his fields as the sun dropped toward the horizon, the light turning the soybean rows, a deep shade of gold across the valley. Tobias asked whether after everything that had happened, Darius had ever considered simply selling the farm and starting somewhere quieter, somewhere far from Bellwether and its long memory. Darius said that people had made a mistake in assuming $14 million was ever the reason he fought so hard to keep it in the first place. He explained that he fought because if one forged signature could erase 4 generations of history, then no one anywhere could ever consider themselves truly safe from the same kind of theft. Darius walked over to the old stone marker, brushing away the dirt that had settled across its worn coordinates, and thought back to the courtroom laughter that had once followed him out of that building into the parking lot. That same laughter had eventually become proof of exactly how easily prejudice could blind powerful people to a truth, standing right in front of them, waiting patiently to be seen by anyone willing to actually look. He thought of Everett still nervous around strangers, but sleeping soundly for the first time in years, and of the widow, 2 counties over, who now kept a framed copy of her restored deed hanging above her kitchen table. He thought of Rochelle, already boarding a flight toward the next county, where another quiet family had lost land. They could not explain carrying the same patient determination that had first brought her to Bellwether. And he thought of the mocking laughter itself, how it had once filled an entire room at his expense, and how silence had eventually replaced it the moment the truth finally arrived through the courtroom doors. Tobias watched his old friend standing at the edge of the property for a long while, before finally speaking again, telling him that very few men could have endured what Darius had endured without turning bitter or vengeful in the process. Darius shrugged off the compliment, saying only that bitterness never once fixed a broken fence or brought back a single acre of stolen ground, while patience and proof, given enough time, usually did. Above them, the last light faded behind the tree line. settling gently over 1,900 acres that had never once stopped belonging to the family who first cleared them by hand. Justice was never measured by the suit. A person wore the money sitting in their account or the title printed beside their name on a courthouse door. Justice only existed the moment the truth was finally heard, even when the person speaking it stood before the court in work boots, still covered in mud from his own land.